Over the course of the year, we have looked at three different major factors that influence behavior: biology, cognition, and sociocultural. The ways in which those around us, both in the immediate group and in the larger culture, can have an immense impact on our attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors make up that third factor. Literally, the facts that we take in about the world and the nature of our lives can be strongly influenced by our environments. The nature of our study of nurture, though, composes two main elements: society/social, as well as culture. In the first one, society, it consists of groups who on some level share different beliefs and practices. For both the people in and out of our social groups, their beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors can have massive influences on how we view ourselves and others. When looking at social and sociocultural psychology, we talked about a couple theories, the first of which was the social identity theory. The main point of this theory is that according to this, an individual's sense of who they are is based on being a member or not of specific social groups. These groups are known as either in-groups or out-groups, and depending on your perspective on whether a person fits within your in-group or they are an out-group to you, can determine your attitudes, values, beliefs, behaviors, so on and so forth. Another theory we talked about was the social cognitive theory. And this suggests that behavior is modeled by other members of a group and acquired through observation or imitation based on consequences of a behavior. And so we are on a rewards and punishments sort of system here. There are cognitive elements to how we process information about the world, including how our schemas, how we attribute behaviors to certain things or certain individuals, and then also stereotypes, which are also influenced by our social groups. Within the social cognitive theory, there are 5 different elements. Conformity and compliance, in which people try to act like other people within the group. Outside of the social cognitive theory, we talked about the idea of social and cultural learning. Where do we take in information from the world around us? Where do we learn these things? And one of the things that we talked about with this was stereotypes and stereotype threat. And stereotype threat, as we talked about, is when a person feels an anxiety, an inner anxiety, that subconsciously leads them to living up or down to the stereotypes that other people have about them. On the other side of the coin is culture. And culture are the practices performed by people within a society. And as we see here, language, medical cures, religion, child rearing methods, food, folk arts, celebrations, all of these different things make up what is culture. Now, within each culture, there are some universal traits that people live on some sort of spectrum on. These are called cultural dimensions. And we talked about these different cultural dimensions being things like power distance index, collectivism versus individualism, uncertainty avoidance index, okay? Femininity versus masculinity, short-term versus long-term orientation, restraint versus indulgence. Within each society, the society exists along a certain part of this spectrum. For instance, with collectivism versus individualism, some societies are more collectivist, some societies are more individualist. And so cultural dimensions sort of fits the cultures on a certain line of that, and it can really impact how others see the world. It can affect your attitudes, your values, your beliefs. If you are in a collectivist country, but you are more of an individualist, how does that sort of change your viewpoint of that culture? How do other people treat you because of the ways in which you act? All of those things are a part of cultural dimensions. We also talked about the ideas of culture and how they influence identity, not just attitudes, behaviors, all of that sort of stuff. We talked about two main terms within this. The first one was enculturation, in which you learn the culture of your origin. Enculturation has a much larger impact on us because it is the first part of socialization that we go through. It is the first culture that we learn. And even if we move to many different cultures throughout our lifetime, that original culture still stays with us to some extent and can influence our attitudes, our values, behaviors. I'm going to keep saying those three words over and over and over again. On the other side is acculturation, and this is adapting and learning a new culture. And acculturation can affect us in our own ways. We talked about the idea of acculturation stress, in which someone moves to a new country and they feel a stress because they are no longer in that culture of origin. And also the fact that certain factors are not surrounding them, like their family, like maybe financial security or economic security. Maybe there's greater discrimination where they've moved to. All of these things can influence us and affect our identities and our attitudes, our values, behaviors, and how we see ourselves. Now, a lot of these different concepts have brought up the idea of perspective. And that's what brings us to the idea of Emic and Etic research. These are both perspectives on how the researcher views themselves within the groups that they are studying and want to find out more about. Along with perspective, how universal is behavior or certain behaviors? And these questions are constantly asked about by researchers. Emic and Etic views are philosophies of research which speak to this inherent question. For Emic studies, we have the insider perspective, where they study one culture alone and only use those theories on that one culture in order to understand culture-specific behavior. While this is nice in terms of really differentiating between this culture and the practices that are within it and how it influences behavior versus another culture, it often is costly and sometimes is not able to be generalized to other settings because of the singular nature of the research. On the other side is Etic, and this compares psychological phenomena across cultures to find out what could be universal in human behavior. The Etic perspective encapsulates most research because it is more cost efficient. You can get more research and conclusions that could be applied to many different people. But just like this Venn diagram shows, oftentimes it's a cross between these two different perspectives that leads to the greatest form of reality. In addition to culture and identity, we have also discussed, albeit very shortly, culture and its effect on cognition. And so within this, there are two different terms that we ended up discussing. And that is the idea of surface versus deep culture. And surface culture, those are the things that we often observe as culture. Things like food, flags, festivals, fashion, holidays, music, arts and crafts, literature, language. All of these different things that we can see are surface culture. However, oftentimes what most affects our cognition is the stuff that exists underneath that. And that is the deep culture, the ideas, the beliefs, the feelings, the attitudes associated with a particular country or culture. And so, like the term might say, deep culture oftentimes influences our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors on a much deeper level. And oftentimes what we also find with cognition is what we talked about with emotion and cognition in the cognitive level of analysis. And that's the idea of flashbulb memories. Oftentimes culture can influence what we deem to be consequential in our lives, and therefore influence what we encode on a very deep level. If there was an attack on our country that would be something that is very consequential to us, and so we remember it on a very deep level. If there was a attack on another country, it's not as consequential to our lives, even though it is still consequential. The last idea that we talked about with culture was the idea of cultural change. And we specifically talked about one particular type of cultural change, or one factor that changed cultures. And that's the idea of geographic mobility. We talked about the concepts of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. And within that, that can really impact our attitudes, values, behaviors. The amount that we end up moving geographically throughout our lifetime can influence how we make friends, how we value relationships. It can change a whole lot about us. Just like the show Friends, depending on how often we move, even though they became very close and could count on each other for quite a lot, that's more the exception and not the rule. And so we end here with the sociocultural level of analysis, looking at that cross-section of how society and culture both influence our values, our attitudes, and behaviors. I got it in one more time.